For the past 2.5 years, everybody has been talking about generative AI. On the creative side, there's a lot of concern and fear about what it means for art in general and people's livelihoods. In this video, I'm going to explain why we should embrace AI, as creatives specifically, and why most of the conversations around what it means for art are overblown and overhyped. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nate Rudichuk. I'm a designer and art director for the gaming industry. I've also had a chance to work on film, television, and commercial productions, as well as design architecture. Quick disclaimer, of course, everything I say here is my opinion and my opinion alone. I have had a chance to talk with tons of researchers and product developers working in the AI space, specifically designing for creatives. I've also had a chance to use these technologies myself. I've come in with a very open mind, and I've also encouraged other artists to do the same thing. Having used this for about 6 months now, professionally and in personal work, I feel that I'm ready to kind of talk about where I see it going. So with that in mind, please enjoy the video. Let's talk about the phrase AI and machine learning. Both are oxymorons. There's no such thing as machines that can learn or comprehend. Certainly, the creative process and the human brain is such a complex organism, we have yet to fully understand its potential, and we certainly cannot replicate it with software and technology yet. I say this because there's a lot of optimism on the short-term gains that we're going to experience as an industry. People have wild assumptions about where AI will take us in the next couple years. I've even read online it's going to replace all the artists in the gaming industry. Anybody can make a game with a couple prompts. It's going to have completely 100% personalized experiences at the touch of a button at the tips of your fingers. And to be honest with you, it's quite laughable in my opinion. The reason being is that most people that are making these claims have never actually shipped product or developed the game themselves. It's so complex to build a video game and so hard that they're really glossing over a lot of the challenges day to day that a developer may or may not face when building something like this. With that being said, the gaming industry is certainly not a stranger to AI and AI tools. It's been around for longer than I've had my career, and it will continue to be around long after. The one constant I will say though, it's never actually replaced anybody. It's always been a tool in a tool belt for an artist or a designer to improve their workflow, and I don't see anything changing from that approach. I think of it like this: AI is a rising tide that will raise all ships. We can build more for cheaper, faster, and probably also, we'll be able to expand the types of products we create with this technology. So instead of reducing jobs and making people obsolete, it'll actually expand our creative potential further than what we can imagine today. So with that in mind, let's specifically talk about AI as a tool, where I see its use cases and really where I don't think it'll have any impact on, and how I think as a tool set, artists can embrace it and really try to integrate it into their workflow. For starters, here's what I believe AI really excels at. Let's talk about where I think AI excels for visual artists. Research. Every designer needs to have research as their initial step in creating a piece. That research can be as simple as getting inspiration for color, mood, and lighting, or as complex as understanding things like how something is manufactured, or the cultural significance of the piece that they are trying to create, and the individual elements within that piece. However, everything really stems back to visual research and text research. This is where I think AI will really accelerate. Helping people gather a substantial visual library is a time-consuming problem that I think every designer can relate to. If we can generate some of those images, as well as supplement what we currently use, there's an opportunity to understand more and create more inspiration for artists before they begin a piece. The second part of really where I see generative AI impacting the creative process is around the sketch and iteration phase. And the goal of this phase really is to take a bunch of different question marks and convert them into answers. You have to take, as a designer, text information, verbal information, some visual information, and combine it and convert it into a few images that either validate or invalidate an idea. I'll give you an example. Frequently, as an art director, I work with other creative directors and other stakeholders for building video games. And everybody has their own opinions and experiments they want to run. And of course, I'd love to do all of them. We just don't have the time. So often, we have to say no to ideas before we even try them, just because we can't afford to do everything. With this, I'm allowed to sketch and create and iterate much faster, so at least in the beginning, we can test to see what's worthwhile of us investing more of our time into and what's not. We are able to solve some of these ideas by creating visuals and coming to them with solutions versus just hypothesizing and saying yes or no in a phone call. This is important because normally with experimentation comes the better idea. You're able to refine a vision much more frequently and much faster than you would be otherwise. Currently what happens is that artists may have to come back with a bunch of sketches and supplement that conversation days or weeks later. And finally, I see generative AI really impacting what I would call the rendering and refining stage. This is where most of the cognitive work has already been done, meaning that the design is already realized, a designer knows what they want and how they want to get there. They now just have to spend the time getting there. Most of the time, for me, this is done by going in between 3D and 2D technologies. Think Blender 3D and Photoshop 2D. A lot of time is spent finding either the right photo to bash in, the right texture, the right model, or even building my own model sets, and certainly it can be very time intensive. For a lot of elements here, I'd rather not build everything from scratch. This is where AI might be able to jump in and serve as a supplementary tool to speed up that process for me. I consider this to be useful for other designers as well. As you can see here though, nothing I've mentioned really talks about how AI will design for us. Certainly it's just tools to speed up a process that we already have to do anyways. Let's talk about where AI falls short. Like any other tool, it lacks the fundamental design knowledge as well as the cultural context, or the why of why something is created. In this example, I'm going to show you exactly what I mean and where I think the designer's place has always been realistically.
So as you can see here, I have this design that I generated with Stable Diffusion. And I wouldn't even really call it a design. It's more like a concept rendering. The reason I say that is because, when you look at it from far enough away, it's not bad, right? You have the general form, it kind of works. But, for anything other than like a 10-second glance, if I were to look at this close up, it really doesn't indicate form or function very much, and certainly it does a terrible job at highlighting how this thing would actually work, aka the function. For example, the joints of this arm, I'm really not sure what's going on here. I think it's trying to get at indications where the arm could be pivoting and rotating like this, but there's really not any indication of how it would rotate like that. And even then it's doing kind of a poor job. Of course, it's suggesting, but it really just doesn't know what to look for. I mean, this doesn't really make much sense why there would be a gigantic thing like this here. You'd have like an armor plate, not an exposed gear. Same thing with the legs. I mean, again, it makes sense, kind of, but it's really incapable of doing any sort of job to define this further. So if you were to say like rig this or animate this, and even build this in 3D, the artist would need a lot more information to go from. Now they could solve it themselves, but the job of a designer really is to take all this information and create a design that's readable by the other team. So if you were to pass this off in a game setting, I as an art director would probably come back and say it needs to be clarified a bit more. You need to show me how this, these legs would move. What's this doing here? Doesn't make much sense. How does this thing rotate? All that stuff. So again, as a general kind of starting point, I think it's really cool. And this one looks fairly generic, but I'm sure if you spent a little bit of time and you did some paint overs, you get something pretty decent for maybe like a Transformer movie or like a Gundam or something. But other than that, you'd have to go right into design manually and actually start to pick apart how you would move this and piece it together, and basically how you would approach it if you were to build it in real life.
Let's talk about embracing change in the industry as professionals. First of all, accept this: change is always a constant. There is never a time when the industry will ever ask permission to change and evolve. It will just happen, with or without you. This is the reality because it's a business. Our design work is used for business goals, and businesses are always looking for ways to improve, save money on, and extend where they can grow and how they can produce something. And the important part about this is that I encourage designers to think about themselves the same way. Your personal work and art for fun is a different conversation. You should create however you want to. However, when you wish to sell those services or sell the work, you have to design like a business. You have to understand where the value of your work sits and really what the industry demand is. And with that being said, I think it's important for us to look at ways we can actually leverage these changes, because a designer does not have to react. They can actually adapt and embrace and become part of that change. They do not have to react. Unfortunately, I think a lot of creatives do not think about themselves like a business. Now, I'm not talking about personal work. People should explore and create art however they want to create if it makes them feel good. But as a business, there are some fundamentals that we have to follow as creatives. First of all, we must understand what our true market value is. You must understand what your work can command and why people are paying you money for it. You must also understand that just because you want something, it's not so. You must service people that are paying you. So if somebody wants a certain design, you have to design something that fits their needs. Also, you should, as a business, be sensitive to new technologies that come out so you can embrace it and improve on the offering and services that you provide. And I think this really gets to the core element of why creatives may be misunderstanding where this technology can go. In my opinion, most of the value that creatives and designers give is not the rendering. It's not how pretty the image is. It's what's being communicated. So in a way, whether AI can design or it can produce an illustration that looks pretty good is kind of irrelevant to the day-to-day job of a designer. People are paying you for the way you see things, for your vision of the world, and for your research abilities on how to execute on a new idea, and do that in a unique way. So none of that really has to do with how well you can render something. Of course, it's always part of it, but realistically, people are looking for design work, not fine artwork, and that's where the challenge is. Fortunately, we see a lot of this on websites like ArtStation or Instagram. The prettiest image is the most sought after by other artists. But the industry isn't really looking at that as a benchmark for where they want to take their work. They need design work. So I'm going to show you a couple design works that I think really represent where most of the time is spent.
Okay, so here I have a couple designs that are actually real, created by engineers, robotics engineers all over the world. But I think the conversation still holds true. Compared to the design that we looked at earlier that was made by Stable Diffusion, there's a lot more indications on how this thing would move believably, right? How it would be constructed, how you could theoretically pilot it, like this man over here. And then, if I was a designer asked to make a more realistic version or a realistic looking robot, again, the one that we looked at was a bit more of a stylized, almost like a Gundam or something. But if I was asked to make a more believable, realistic robot, I would pull out a references for something like this, because you can really see how movement would work with a machine like this. There's a little bit of like a hinge going on here in this joint. You can see how things would rotate, on these axes here. And so, of course, like the points of motion are more clearly defined. So if you were to pass off a design that had a holistic view of this layout here to a 3D modeler or an animator, they could certainly understand much faster how they would actually use this and how they would make it look alive, right? They would understand where the joints would bend, where they would rotate, and so they could actually create a more believable model that way. A lot of the work is being done and solved kind of in the design phase. And like I said earlier, with the image that I showed you previously, none of that design work is really solving those questions that the 3D team or the animation team or production would really have with with the design. So effectively, you're making something look nice, but you're not really solving anybody's issues, and that's a problem. But with something like this, and referencing the real world, which is really where AI does not do well in, this is the important part, and this is what can actually separate you as a designer. AI will never be able to understand why this robot here, why this works. But a human can, and again, they can always leverage AI to aid in this, but certainly not lead the design process.
So let's talk about the business of creativity. It's a very important element that I think a lot of artists and designers choose to ignore. And it's unfortunate because, realistically, anybody in this industry must think of themselves as a business. What you are offering is a service that should be competitive and should satiate market demand. What does that mean? Sometimes the market will dictate that we need to design a certain way, and we should produce things in a certain way that help and provide service to somebody's needs. Sometimes that requires us to change the way we work. And it's unfortunate maybe, but it's a reality that we must accept. But it's not something that should be done begrudgingly. If a creative is sensitive to this and aware, they can actually adapt quite fast and become a leader. Becoming a market leader is very important, I think, for people who want to have a long and fruitful design career, because businesses do not know what they're looking for. They just want an outcome. A designer can be very sensitive to that outcome and actually produce and research and create something that is extremely valuable to that business, more so than they would ever know themselves. Let's talk about embracing change in the industry. The reality is, change is a constant. New technologies come out all the time, and the industry will never ask permission to try to adopt or experiment with it. You as a designer can accept it and embrace it, or you can fight it or not use it, and that's totally okay. I think, though, we do have a duty to ourselves to look at what the reality of design work is. Design is a business, and we are all business people, just as much as we are artists. That may sound very counterintuitive to the creative process because it is, but we must look at ourselves that way. Otherwise, who are we designing for? We exist to serve, professionally at least, to serve a greater purpose and produce something that other people can get value from. And in order to do that, we must understand what they need and what's valuable to other people. Certainly, I've felt the same way, where my personal work and my personal creative process may be a bit different from how I create things professionally. And sometimes that might upset me, but I have to adapt to that reality that somebody's paying me for a specific outcome. I can disagree with that outcome, but I have to deliver if I want to participate in that business. And the reason I bring this up is because of this. If you look at AI as a way to potentially improve your business offering and get you closer to a solution with somebody else, then it is actually quite a good thing. It's not a bad thing. Certainly, it doesn't need to be something that you use for your personal work, but it may actually help you make more money and satisfy people that are trying to get the most out of your design work. Finally, I think we should look at this. As a designer, you must understand really where your value lies. It is not in how well you render an image. It's not in a pretty picture that you can paint. Of course, that's very fun, but a true value for a designer would be in how you think. People are paying you for how you solve problems and how you think about those problems. That is where I think the money is made, but also that's really where the design value comes from. So if you can change your thinking to service that, you'll notice that most of the conversations around AI are actually quite positive. I'll give you two examples of where the creative process has had new technology introduced to it previously and been met with a lot of friction from incumbent designers. The first one is photo bashing. When I first started, photo bashing was still kind of coming in and being used as a standardized tool, and some people were very apprehensive to what that meant. It wasn't considered to be high art. It wasn't considered to be the correct way to design. It was considered to be a lazy shortcut. And in fact now, a lot of artists that photo bash still have to understand the process and the fundamentals, but are able to get where they want to go much faster. I would consider it to be a very standard use of game art technology. Another example would be the integration of 3D tools. So again, most artists are 2D based initially and then either decide to learn 3D or decide not to. But now, I would consider things like Blender to be such a standard tool in the industry that not knowing it is actually a hindrance. being able to get different viewpoints, rapidly iterate, send files that are universally editable, test things out in a game engine. Those are all elements that 3D gave concept artists and designers the ability to have. And again, at the beginning, I think it was met with apprehension, specifically around certain art directors. Some people did not want to see that kind of deliverable work in the piece. For any other reason then, it was new and it wasn't considered quality work. Now, I would argue that, again, it's a standard tool. We really can't avoid it, and it's the reality. To me, this is where I really see a lot of generative AI tools headed. It'll be something that becomes standard and really not exciting, and certainly nothing controversial about it will happen. It'll just be another tool that we can use to improve the workflow in some instances. That's it. So let's recap what we just talked about. Firstly, I think most of the conversations around AI today are either wildly optimistic or wildly pessimistic. Realistically, we'll probably get somewhere in between, right? It'll be a tool that's very valuable, but not as exciting as we once thought. Certainly, I don't think it will replace anybody here in the industry. Secondly, we talked about observing tools and really analyzing its benefits and its shortcomings. For generative AI specifically, I think I've highlighted that fairly extensively with its use in research, sketching, and then even refining some designs that you have. But again, the shortcomings here are very simple. It's not a designer. All the design work that you have to do up here is still yours to make, and that's where your voice really stands out. Relying on a tool to do that is never going to work. It has never worked in the past, and certainly not something I would advise if you want to pursue this as a profession. Thirdly, with the word profession in mind, I think it's very important to acknowledge what we're trying to do here. This is a business. Personal work aside, this is a way for people to feed their family and grow a business. So you must think about this with that mentality. Your design work is only valuable to the market when it provides a service that people need. You should always be sensitive to what that service looks like because it's important. As always, I encourage people to come in with an open mind and be optimistic about the future. You never know where it's going to head, so we might as well be happy and excited about where it could go. I encourage any artist who is critical of AI to test out the design tools. Test it out. Don't use it professionally, but just try and see what it can do for you. Maybe you'll fall in love with it, maybe you won't be impressed at all, but ultimately, what we know is better than what we don't know. Finally, I'd like to leave you with this. Nobody can control what happens tomorrow, let alone 5 years. Certainly, we can only change how we adapt or react. I recommend being positive because what's the point otherwise? We might as well be positive and excited about the future, and if something has to change, we react and adapt to it. With that being said, anybody who has not had the chance to try out AI tools, I highly recommend it. Even if you hate it or despise it, it's always important to come in with no opinions and be open-minded, give something a chance, and then formulate a thought on it. You may be impressed, you may not care about it, you may still hate it, and that's okay. But please always be open to trying something new. I've been Nate Rudichuk. I hope to see you again. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. Goodbye.